Welcome to the third video in this series, Deep Brain Reorienting, where I describe a neurobiological perspective on dissociation. So this is an interesting study. fMRI research found increased hyperconnectivity across many regions and pathways of the brain in people with the dissociative subtype of PTSD. I've included just some of the areas featured in that paper. This makes sense. An unpredictable traumatic world requires a range of adaptive responses, and this accounts for the strong global networking we see in this study. Indeed, in people with dissociation, we often see a range of flexible responses, such as overactivity and underactivity. However, deep brain reorienting suggests that we look beneath the cortex for an understanding of how these adaptive changes may have arisen. Might the widespread activation of these cortical regions point to the involvement of the deeper brain stem? In other words, what energizes this hyperconnectivity, these areas that are not usually connected in this way? As you will remember from the previous videos in this series, we are using a brainstem model to understand various trauma responses. This video will look again at each of these brainstem structures and their relationship to dissociative symptoms. Trauma, including adverse developmental experiences, can be so overwhelming that they give rise to states of dissociation. These states are multifaceted, and it's important clinically that we discriminate between their different forms and the hypothesized brain mechanisms involved in each of them. We'll first look at how the superior colliculi can give rise to a dissociative response by turning away from the trauma at a deep level. We call this supracortical dissociation. We'll also look at the potential effects of the locus coeruleus on our connection to reality. The locus coeruleus is involved in a shock response with noradrenaline transmission across the cortex. We suggest that this neuroactivation of shock may disrupt cortical functioning such that there is a disconnect from reality, what Frank Corrigan calls intracortical dissociation. And finally, when we turn to look at the periaqueductal grey, we find that it's sufficiently resourced with analgesic neurochemicals that contribute to drowsy and disconnected states, another form of dissociation. Let's look at each of these in turn. As we have covered in this series, the superior colliculi are the orienting structures of the brain, which have the capacity to turn towards or away from something. In our theory of dissociation, we suggest that a disconnection from what is horrifying, painful, or distressing is a fundamental turning away from it. Receiving bad news and disbelieving what you're hearing may have roots at this collicular level. In psychotherapy, the therapist may even witness the client physically turn away from the traumatic material they're encountering. The term supracortical here refers to the fact that the superior colliculi are therefore operating above or over the cortex. In other words, this turning away is occurring at a deep unconscious level, not at a thinking level. We're now looking at the dissociative effects of the locus coeruleus, what is called intracortical dissociation, intra referring to inside the cortex. Here we are specifically interested in those types of dissociation that include alterations to our sense of self and the world. We suggest that the arousal of the cortex by ascending neurotransmitter systems, for example noradrenaline from the locus coeruleus, disturbs the coherent functioning of the cortex and therefore the subjective experience of the self and the world. Some of the associated effects might include depersonalization, derealization, and other disturbances to our perception of space and time. Now the periaqueductal grey and its involvement in dissociative phenomena. We return to our neuroanatomical model of the periaqueductal grey to describe the neurochemicals involved in dissociative responses. Recall that the dorsal areas of the periaqueductal grey are involved in active responses, whilst the ventral portions are involved in passive coping strategies. When the related physiological response is intense, these two areas have associated neurochemicals that act as analgesics, dampening the traumatic experience. So when the active defense area is dominant, when panic, grief, fear, rage, and their related high arousal is overwhelming, there can be a release of endogenous cannabinoids. These may be experienced as emotions going fuzzy, lightheadedness, and dizziness. When the passive defense area is dominant, when feelings of helplessness and submission are intense, then endogenous opioids mediate the emotional pain. This can be experienced as tiredness, sleepiness, and warmth. Therapists may observe the effects of these neurochemicals in the therapy room when clients are encountering intense affects. So, we have covered the fundamental disconnection at the level of the superior colliculi. We have looked at the effects of shock responses on our connection with reality, and we have outlined the effects of neurochemical analgesics. It may be some combination of these that leads to what van der Hart calls structural dissociation. Many of you will be familiar with the structural dissociation model, including fight, flight, freeze, submit, and attach systems. These are the systems we have described earlier in this series, rooted in the superior colliculi for orienting and the periaqueductal grey for affects and defences. However, emotional parts don't typically engage fully in fight, flight, freeze, submit, and attach. They might instead engage in fight through confrontation, flight through alcohol, drugs, or avoidance, submission through compliance, and so on. Indeed, Colin Ross described alters in dissociative identity disorder as having a distinct sensorium and being alert and cognitively intact. This suggests that those emotional self-states have circuitry or loops in the cortex, in areas for thinking, attention, and memory, rather than in brainstem loops. So somehow self-states that have their origins in the brainstem, in areas responsible for emotion and defense, have become detached into upper-level cortical circuits. Van der Hart's model also included apparently normal parts. These are self-states that function relatively independently of traumatized parts of self. So, the likelihood is that apparently normal parts also require complex cortical circuitry in order to be autonomous and have such flexible functions as engaging with work, parenting, and relationships. To summarize here, alters or parts of the personality manifest through upper-level circuitry, whereas much of the traumatic experience relevant to their origins is held in lower-level circuitry. As you will recall, the affects of fear, rage, grief, panic, and shame are all held in the brainstem and its associated circuits, as well as emotional pain and aloneness. The episodic memories of what happened, held by parts of the self that have their own way of acting in the world, are held by upper-level circuitry. They have separated from the brainstem orienting and defensive loops. In people without dissociative identity disorder, we might illustrate what is happening in their brain through a figure 8. The upper and lower level circuitry generally work well together. The purpose of this is to facilitate smooth running of various different functions. For example, we have the lower level brainstem loops involved in defensive responses and actions to what is happening in the world. We also have the upper level cortical loops that are involved in actions with more complex organizations, such as our personality. All of these loops tend to work harmoniously so that decisions can be made that are consistent with our personality, motivations, thoughts, and feelings. However, in dissociative identity disorder, the upper level loops are functionally separated in an unusual way that allows the emergence of both emotional and apparently normal parts of the personality. We think that the brainstem focus of DBR helps to reintegrate different levels of the brain so that there is more coherent functioning.